I'm Michael Altman. I'm Michael Altman, Director of Research for the Center for Research in Equitable and Open Scholarship, which is supporting this talk today, MIT Libraries. And we are pleased to have Dr. Alexander Chasanoff here, who not only is an incoming member of the North Carolina Central School's Information Science School, but has been a postdoc here in the libraries under the CLIR program support. We're happy to welcome her back. As you know, CREOS supports basic research in equitable and open scholarship, hence the name. And part of that of establishing scholarship that's equitable and open is making scholarship that is sustainable and durable. Right? Those are things that's been called out in the research. And so Dr. Chasanoff will be talking about software preservation, and it's currently a niche thing because only every empirical article that has been, or almost every empirical article in science that has been published in the last couple of decades has involved applying software to data. So it may be time to look at the preservation of software more seriously.
Okay, great. Ooh. Everybody hear me okay? Okay, great. A little bit of a complex setup, so I'm not advancing slides. That doesn't make sense. Please advance your slides. But thank you, Micah, for introducing me, and it's so nice to see so many of you here. I did my postdoc here from 2016 to 2018, working largely on this research project, which was really cool to be able to kind of think and explore what makes meaningful access to software and what would we want to be preserving about software over time. And so it's probably important to say from the start that for folks who aren't affiliated with libraries, our concern and our approach for this project was really to think about what we could do to facilitate access for libraries and archives who were interested in preserving research software as a scholarly object, right? So not just something on GitHub necessarily, but what could a place like MIT that has a really rich history of technological artifacts and all sorts of really interesting both legacy artifacts and, being produced today software, how could we think about how the research library can play a role in that? So that's sort of the context. I'm currently a research program officer at the Educopia Institute in Greensboro, North Carolina. And I did just accept a faculty position, yay, at that's right, yeah, so, which is news probably to some of you, so that's good news. So, yeah, I'm very excited. I'll be starting actually August 1st. Wow. So, yeah. And this project is really kind of the culmination of 10 years of thinking about digital curation and digital preservation in libraries and archival settings. And so, yeah, that's the, uh-oh. Might be asleep. Okay, I might. So where we are today, so background to this problem, the scholarly record is increasingly computational. That probably isn't news to anyone in this room. But the background for our exploratory research was really this larger context of changes brought about by this exponential growth in digital information, technologies, tools, and different research environments. And so scholars are now increasingly reliant on software and software-driven research outputs, right? So these have actually transformed the nature of the scholarly record itself. And so at the turn of this past century, the scientific literature is seeking to establish best practices for computational scholarship. And they begin to push for kind of publishing not just your scientific results, but also how you came up with your scientific results. What were your data? What were your algorithms? What were your software? All of that being packaged together in a way as meaning that it would be a scholarly research object would be a compendium of all of those things. Ooh, it worked. So for research libraries and archives who are tasked with documenting, preserving, providing access to the scholarly record over time, right? So this shift to kind of born digital and computational materials in the last decade has introduced challenges for both scientific and cultural heritage. So on the one hand, you have research scholars who are creating, producing, and disseminating forms of scholarship in born digital research outputs. But also the very form of the actual scholarship has changed, right? So what's considered to be part of the scholarly record, the research objects that are included in that, are of a variety of forms. And how you identify what those boundaries are has implications for what we're curating and preserving, because what you want to capture and what the significant properties that you might want to capture to preserve, to provide access to software in the future depends on kind of how you're defining it today, right? So that's sort of like a baseline caveat, or not caveat, but sort of a truism of digital curation is that we're trying to understand the context in how we define something today so that we can provide meaningful access to it in the future. And so why that's interesting is because we can't really say, we're not future historians, right? We can't really say what someone might find meaningful today, what a historian of code might find meaningful in 20 years. We can't say for certain, but what we can do is understand sort of what the characteristics of the software are that make it meaningful for people now. And so understanding how software historians are using code as evidence of historical trends, or kind of understanding the cultural heritage aspects of software as, you know, a cultural heritage artifact that an archive would preserve and make accessible is one means of kind of thinking about preserving scientific and cultural heritage for the long term. Okay. So what's different about born digital information? So in this switch from kind of analog to digital environments and digital ways of working, the complexities in the space of preserving digital resources are conceptual as much as they are technical. And if we think about, you know, example A and example B, I use these to kind of contrast what we're looking at today as a scholarly object versus what might have been a scholarly object and probably still is, obviously. You know, libraries are not going anywhere. But, you know, if we think about these two things having the same intellectual content, so for example, say this is a book that was published, first edition, it's got certain characteristics that define what its scholarly value is. Similarly, it could be the same content. This could be actually somebody typewriting a draft of the same book. The intellectual content might be the same, but how you access and understand and preserve the information on object B is of a completely different nature. And it's not that it's an either or thing. I think, you know, if you look at book conservation, there's a whole rich history there. But digital preservation and digital curation for, you know, media artifacts is thinking about how to stabilize the medium of information. And so the intellectual content may be the same, but how you actually preserve and make it accessible over time and provide access to it is going to be a completely different endeavor. And so understanding that as the basis for what sorts of strategies you might bake into your workflow is an important part of understanding, you know, how research libraries can take care of these kinds of materials over time. Because to even see some of the content that's on object B, as Joe knows, you need a write blocker. You need software that's going to actually let you extract the content that's on a floppy media disk, right? And then you have to worry about things like alteration. You have to worry about making sure that you're not altering the content. And so there's just all sorts of concerns about born digital information that matter when we think about preserving them from a scholarly perspective. And so I touched on this a little bit, but why preserving software in particular is difficult. If we think about it from an archival and library perspective, I mean, some of these, like I said, are challenges in collecting. So what do we consider to be software? What are the boundaries? What do we want to be providing access to in the future, right? Is this considered, this printout here, is this considered its code printout? Is this considered software, or software only software when it's in its executable state? And so these were sort of the questions that we grappled with when I first came here, is kind of defining what software, when we're talking about preserving software, what actually does that mean? And who's defining those boundaries? Because you can think about software as a heritage artifact, and you can also think about it as a process. So something that needs to be active and that's contributing to, and needs to be alive, and is, contributing to the production of other kinds of research software. And so these sort of conceptual challenges are very difficult. And then there are the technical challenges that I already sort of touched on, but when you think about what a floppy disk is versus what a book is, you can't just look at a floppy disk and say, okay, this is, you can't just visibly perceive what's on the floppy disk. You need additional ways and mechanisms to get access to that information. So it introduces a whole nother range of complexities and workflow complications. And so the technical challenges are really about kind of how you're trying to even get at that baseline view of that information. And so I'm using a floppy disk, but this is sort of, any removable media this could be true for. And archives and libraries are increasingly acquiring, hard drives and accessioning removable media, because that's where scholars are doing their work, right? So as we start to think about like 10, 15 years from now, the collections that we're working with are going to potentially be, hard drives with Word documents. And as archivists and librarians, we need to be kind of thinking about how we're going to be making sense of that. So thinking about the technical, the social, the organizational, right? It's never just a technical challenge, even though people talk about software preservation. And that's why for Micah and I and Nance McGovern, we were really focused on thinking about this from a sociomaterial perspective. So we wanted to think about all the different angles of what it means to curate something, not just to preserve it, not just to be able to access it in the future, but to take care of it and to stabilize it and to make sure that meaningful access was preserved. And so our motivation in this project was to think about how we could position research libraries as stewards to assist with the process of preserving scholarly research. And so, despite the fact that this is kind of a relatively new phenomenon, the idea of preserving research and capturing software and related outputs as part of the scholarly record, we all know libraries have a long history with a focus on collecting, preserving, and providing access to resources for the pursuit of knowledge, right? So it's not such a huge conceptually to think about libraries as caretakers. And that's what computational resources need. So since at least the 1980s, archivists working with electronic information and electronic record keeping have been helping to establish notions about what it means to be preserving and providing access to authentic information. And so they've really been working in this space already. And the concepts of digital libraries that kind of came about in the 90s and 2000s really was a way to kind of think about providing access to all this increasing exponential amounts of digital information that were coming online. So things of scholarly and institutional significance, right, these require active caretaking, as we said. So securing stewards who are familiar with digital curation and preservation. These are really important because they know the practices and they have the background and the scientific training. I mean, archives are actually an archival science where you have to go and get a master's, right? So there are specific reasons why that you learn in digital preservation. You learn how to deal with these materials. And one of the most significant aspects of digital preservation that I was able to apply to this problem area is the idea of significant properties. And so back in 2007, Andrew Wilson defined significant characteristics as characteristics that must be preserved over time in order to ensure the continued accessibility, usability, and meaning of the objects and their capacity to be accepted as evidence of what they purport to record. So this concept is really useful when you're thinking about or trying to understand what future scholars might want or need from their interactions with born digital information. And the library, as kind of the space for safekeeping of born digital information, is, you know, understands that scholarship itself is a moving target. And so in order to continue to provide access to scholarship and the scholarly record, it's important to be aware and abreast of kind of new practices and new ways of producing and disseminating information. And so when we started this project, we were interested in pushing some of the conceptual approaches that already existed. So people who work in digital archives and digital curation are probably familiar with at least the model on the left, which is the DCC curation lifecycle model. And the one on the right is just another example of a research data curation lifecycle model. But I found these models to be sort of troubling, and I think Nance and Micah did as well, in terms of thinking about data being kind of pushed through into the cycle. That kind of perspective really didn't capture kind of the interdependencies and some of the complexities of that information. And so it was felt to us to be sort of a monolithic approach to what data actually is, and not understanding sort of, we wanted an approach that captured more of the journey and the relationships and the contingencies that are at play, because when you're thinking about preserving these objects, you need to know what those are. And so in terms of developing curation strategies for research libraries, you know, we were thinking about what do you actually need to do to software as a complex object operating in this increasingly complicated ecosystem to support future access and user and use scenarios across the library. So that was sort of our interest in pushing beyond these models. And so this was our research question. What significant ecosystem characteristics support long-term access to and use of research software for different areas of practice? And this ecosystem approach, which is something that we got from Clifford Geertz, who's a cultural anthropologist from the 60s. So his framing of the ecosystems approach is really to think about sort of all of those contingencies and the material, what he calls the material interdependencies among the group of organisms, which form a community. And so thinking about software, but also thinking about caretakers and thinking about researchers as separate ecosystems. So what do all of these people need in terms of this research question? You know, when I'm thinking about software and supporting long-term access to it, software itself has certain needs, right? It needs to be kept alive. It needs to be refreshed. It needs to be migrated. And these are sort of truisms, and it's kind of probably weird to think about software as its own entity, but I found it to be pretty useful and helpful in terms of mapping out what it might mean to sort of to think about software as an entity itself, because I think a lot of the research data management work that was being done, at the time at least, it was sort of like the software was sort of being put into GitHub, and that was the end of it. And presuming that, that would be accessible in the future, but instead, how can we actually recognize that putting it into GitHub, is that really any different than keeping it on a floppy disk in a library shelf, which is kind of the state of our cultural heritage legacy collections. There's a lot of floppy disks out there that have not been processed. And so just thinking about how to take a more active caretaking role. And so this was kind of the underlying focus of how we approached our model, was to sort of understand the different needs and practices of these intersecting stakeholders. And so to think about caretakers and researchers and software as different stakeholders. And so, we were interested in knowing more about the researchers who were creating the research software, but also how they were using it and reusing it and what their needs were around that. And then we also wanted to look at caretakers, because that meant, understanding more about how archives and librarians are currently accessioning materials, but also kind of seeing where their workflow might run into problems for this sort of thing. So if we're acquiring software, for example, and I think a couple of you in the room can speak to this, because I think there was an acquisition tool specifically built for incoming born digital stuff. But I mean, how are you making sure that that information is being transferred and transferred successfully? And, for increasingly large amounts of information, how are we streamlining that process? And so if we do, as research libraries, want to be kind of moving towards taking computational care and access, we need to be sort of scaling up for a lot of this and understanding what the baseline requirements are for transferring large amounts of information safely. And third, we also, as I said, wanted to consider the software itself as an entity, because so much of the research data management literature on this takes a really static view of the scholarly object, and instead we were really interested in fleshing out what was actually a dynamic and complex information. So understanding what characteristics of software were important to curate and to make sure, and when I say curate, I mean to sort of actively take care of, to make sure that we could ensure meaningful access and use in the future. So, a research methodology. Well, this was exploratory research, and at the time we started to do it in 2016, there was no official definition for software curation. And so my postdoc, my official title was Software Curation Fellow. And so I had a long history in digital curation, but I didn't know really that much about software curation, and turned out really that wasn't a thing yet. So myself and four other postdocs were working in this specific space in software curation. So one was at MIT, that's me. We had somebody at Yale, we had somebody at Berkeley, and we also had somebody at the California Digital Libraries. And so the four of us kind of worked together to establish some of what we thought was relevant in the domain in terms of thinking about how research libraries can participate in curation of software. And so part of that was just figuring out what the landscape was, right? So anybody who's done exploratory research, you know that it's a lot of kind of iterative, going back and forth, refining your expectations, testing things, hunches, etc., but being open to kind of whatever emerges. And so the first part of our research was really just in trying to understand what the landscape was. And that was a pretty significant part of everything, because there was that giant gap between sort of research data management, thinking about research software and people writing in the scientific literature about these issues, and then the sort of digital curation and digital preservation world, thinking about complex digital objects. And so, we became really interested in kind of marrying these two sort of disparate views. And so using MIT as kind of the basis for our case studies, we first identified dimensions from the literature, and we did an environmental scan, and we looked around campus, and we said, okay, what institutionally significant software exists here at MIT? And so the purpose of this activity was to kind of identify the kinds of content that a research library like MIT that was, might be interested in preserving and providing access to. And we found research software everywhere. We found it in different institutional and physical domains. We found it in faculty offices, in department closets, on web pages, cloud servers. These were all sort of the different spaces where we identified research software. And that's relevant to this topic, right? Because that's part of the problem in a way, right? So if the library is going to be participating in the caretaking of these materials, we need to actually be caretaking for them physically, or at least have a digital copy of them, and helping to stabilize that content without it being kind of locked away in a faculty closet. And this is very institutionally significant software is all over the place here, and so it's really interesting. But it was also a little alarming. But it kind of convinced me even more that, this is something that research libraries can really be playing a role in, because there's so much rich and interesting information that's been created here. And so we began to specifically look at a literature review that focused on research data management, game preservation, software and code studies, digital and data curation, digital preservation. And we scoped our review to focus on research related specifically to academic libraries. So topics like software engineering or rights management were considered out of scope. And then in our analysis, we reviewed both empirical studies and practitioner guidelines to kind of surface some of the common topical areas. And then we began to iteratively develop a baseline instrument for conducting case study research. So using the previous analysis to inform the kind of scope and research questions. So we didn't even know what the research questions were in this area, basically, because, it was undefined. So we kind of refined those for the first, I would say, 6 months to a year of the project. Was really kind of moving back and forth between, is this a research question? What is our, kind of trying to figure out. But having that tight scope of research libraries and looking specifically, moving into specific case studies was really helpful for kind of tightening the scope. So we used a compilation of software-related inquiries captured by the MIT Libraries Data Management Services Group, as well as a compilation of software-related projects at MIT to identify 12 representative scenarios that were examples of institutionally significant research software. And then we evaluated each of these cases and ranked them based on institutional importance, diversity, representativeness, can't say that word, and participation. So both Micah and myself evaluated the list, and we ultimately selected 5 cases for further analysis. And so this is one view. Ooh, that boundary conditions S is a little, yeah. So the overall goal of what we were doing here in our cross-case comparison was to explore and articulate and characterize what it would mean to actually curate and improve the preservation readiness of research software in library settings. And so we applied a qualitative case study analysis to each of our cases, and we were able to identify the set of features that were important to making curatorial decisions across the collection. And so in analyzing our case studies, we used a sociomaterial lens to broaden our analysis and our understanding of what these different intersecting drivers and factors were that influenced curation actions. So throughout the research software lifecycle, adopting different stakeholder perspectives across different domains and disciplines. And if you're not familiar, sociomaterial perspectives are really useful for research that seeks to make visible the material dynamics in practice situations, the relationships among bodies, tools, technologies, and settings, as well as the human intentions, expertise, and communication. So for me, that was a really good fit for what we were envisioning this model to be, is to be sort of this idea that would view software as not just software by itself, but software that has relationships and software that has, an active life. And also, in terms of my background in archives and digital preservation and curation, knowing that some of the factors that are significant for digital preservation are really social, organizational, technical, as I said before. These are not things that are kind of isolated to just, if we want to curate software in a research library setting, we need to actually have an organizational perspective and a social perspective and a technical perspective. So wanting to adopt that instead of doing the sort of privileging either a technological or human-centric understanding was really important to me. So modeling. So this might be a little hard to read, but we identified 6 focal areas that we labeled curation dimensions. So for research libraries that were possibly interested in developing services to target software preservation, the idea was to kind of surface areas of attention, these curation dimensions that could be useful for institutions to focus for their preservation readiness. So just to give you an example, one of the dimensions we identified as relevant to software curation was capturing information about the carrier for software. And so what that might mean is understanding how stable and assessing how stable a carrier is, right? So there's actual ratings and there's a whole technology behind, understanding what a particular carrier is and evaluating it for long-term stability. And this information is, very relevant to what we're talking about because, if you're on sort of removable magnetic media, the software is living on that provides certainly a very potentially at risk of obsolescence. It introduces different challenges as opposed to kind of software that's living on a website or cloud storage. And so understanding not just sort of understanding what the characteristics were that were relevant to keeping software alive and functional. And then these driving questions that we had are just examples from the literature that from our literature review, that kind of were guidelines and kind of indicators for us. So for the carrier example, so one of the driving questions is in what file and media format are these resources of interest instantiated, and what risks are there to future understanding by keeping it in that format, right? So keeping something on floppy disk presents a certain amount of risk versus extracting and migrating it or reformatting magnetic media in the case of the example we're going to look at. So understanding how each of these dimensions could be applied to our case studies helped us to refine the significant characteristics that were at play in the ecosystem of software curation and preservation. And so just looking specifically at one of our case studies, which came from from IASC, which is now Distinctive Collections. Okay. So in the MIT, well, I'm just going to say MIT archives, the JCR Licklider collection was a collection that was suggested to me by Nora as a good place to possibly start to investigate what historical and legacy software might look like. And as many of you know, Licklider is widely hailed as an influential figure for his visionary ideas around personal computing and human-computer interaction. The Licklider collection had a particular software called Grapple, which was a dynamic graphical programming system developed while Licklider was at the MIT Laboratory for Computer Science. Whether or not the Grapple software actually exists in an instantiated version, I still don't know. But what I do know is that there were rich collections of documentation in the archives, and a couple of computer tape reels that were undated and potentially have information on them, but chances of them being reformatted, I mean, they were kind of unprocessed, as a lot of these materials are. So in terms of what was immediately, accessible, a lot of it was documentation. And so when I did my survey, I looked specifically for materials related to the development of the software. And I found things like, the now defunct programming language, MDL, which stands for More Data Types Than Lisp. And so, the evidence of that programming language, I'm sure, exists in different collections, but it does provide, by looking at those code printouts and seeing kind of user manuals and technical reports, you're learning more about JCR Licklider's vision for this, what ends up being, a visual information, visual browsing system that he was developing throughout the late 70s and early 80s. And so the documentation contains substantial information about it. And so if you analyze the user manual reports, the source code printouts, et cetera, you begin to have a scholarly understanding of the functionality and the purpose of Grapple. Do you need the software to be running to actually recreate the experience? That is a question for further research, and people have, complicated perspectives on that. But I still make the case that you can get a lot from the documentation that's already there. And, for example, there was a pamphlet entitled User Friendliness and All That, that JCR Licklider created, and he talks about the problem of mediating between immediate end users and professional computer people to successfully aid in a reductionist understanding of computers. And so I found that interesting because, that's already back in 1981, a conscious acknowledgement that there was, this important abstraction function to software. And so, historians of software might find, or people who are thinking historically about these artifacts might find that interesting. Other historians who are looking at code specifically might be interested in the specific languages that are going defunct. And so, so drawing from the key preservation models and theories that we reviewed during the initial phase of research, we mapped curation dimensions onto specific phases in the different stewardship phases of research software that might be undertaken in the context of an institutional setting. And we asked ourselves, how can research libraries as caretakers improve the preservation readiness of research software throughout that life cycle? And we outlined some of the decision points that would help guide preservation strategies. So we used previous work by Nancy McGovern, who conceptualized a template-based approach to aid organizations in managing digital content over their lifetime. And we created we outlined some of the decision points. So understanding a little bit more about what some of the criteria that research libraries might be facing in terms of the life cycle of research software from creation to publication or preservation was sort of the guiding impetus here for this. And just to kind of pick out some of this, so if we look at kind of software creation even, so some of the decision points that we surfaced for stewardship organizations such as research libraries would be asking, what particular trainings and workshops can libraries offer? And in particular, and we do a good job of this at MIT, I know, or Phoebe does an awesome job at this, in terms of kind of thinking about what what we can do to make our software and our research code that we're creating more preservation ready. It can be cleaning up, excess files. It can be creating a README file, right? There's all these different strategies that you can kind of build into your training that libraries could be instructing on. And so that's kind of, that follows with all of these different kind of research questions that are really actually kind of decision points. And so just to kind of zoom in on those. So some of the decision points for caretakers that we kind of hit against in trying to think about sort of how we might implement this is, decisions around what kinds of software MIT wanted to collect and preserve and provide access to. And then sort of institutional decisions about what defines software, right? So these questions that I already talked about in terms of what the boundaries are of software. And, how do we want to provide access to these things? What's meaningful about providing access via, do we need to provide access to a operational version of the software in order for it to be meaningful? And then finally, what preservation strategies would best fit the institutional commitment to these resources? So would it be migration, emulation, documentation, et cetera? So thinking through what those pathways might be and how best to caretake for software over time. And I think the decision points illustrate how having a sociomaterial approach is really useful for cutting across both the organizational, the social, and the technical aspects of kind of developing things like policies for information governance, right? But then there's also the sort of more technical aspects of preservation. So deciding what migration strategy to use. In terms of future work, so our research modeled software curation is sort of this active caretaking practice to support the meaningful creation, use, and reuse of software. We approached research software stewardship within this larger context of intersecting needs, uses, and practices. And while preservation criteria might change according to who the stakeholders are, those 6 curation dimensions provide at least a target for focusing efforts in terms of improving preservation readiness. And there's a host of kind of future areas of research that have the potential for high impact outcomes, right? So how, some of this we've already talked about, how can we safely acquire and transfer large amounts of information? What kinds of digital preservation metadata do we need to describe software? How do our workflows need to change to accommodate this? So these are all sort of areas that require further experimentation. And I would also add, how do we increase our resources and capacity in our archives and research libraries? Because I think it's important to acknowledge that this is a very ambitious unicorn level view of how we can, as opposed to the sort of current reality on the ground in archives and research libraries. So kind of prioritizing the importance of this is going to be, a significant effort, but it will be worth it. Yeah, I think I will stop there and probably take some questions. There is a lot in there. The project blog documents, I did writing over the 2 years of the project, and so you can visit my blog and see some of the software curation posts. I think the most recent post is just a huge listing of resources that I ended up compiling that can help with different parts of this process. And then we recently published a JSIS article, which I think is only available in early view, but it will be out now, which goes into this in much, much greater detail. There's a lot to cover. So, yeah, I look forward to, thank you for listening, and I look forward to questions.
Mic is coming over.
Have you looked at the cost? How much it would cost to, save those software, for future use? Assume that the person who wrote it still around.
Right. We did not include any sort of cost estimates in our preservation because mostly the work was really conceptual at this stage. I would say that the second part, which I probably should have mentioned, is that right now a lot of the work that I've done and the templates that I made is actually in pilot testing with the Software Preservation Network. And so that's something that I would assume and, that will be produced as part of that project is sort of a baseline cost estimate for preservation. But I mean, it really, I think, depends on, I could talk about that from legacy artifacts much easier than I can kind of large computational processing. So future work.
You don't need the microphone, do we? I just wanted to say, great.
You do need. You do. The folks online can't hear you.
Okay. Hello, remote people. Great to have you back. Thank you, CREOS. I wanted to ask you if you could elaborate on what you said about the operational version of software for it to be meaningful. I wrote it down. Can you open that up a little more? Were you thinking of Docker type containerization type things, or completely outside of that? What?
Yeah, I mean, I think, well, Docker is something that comes up when I've talked about this in the past, and it wasn't what I was referring to there, but I will say that Docker is a great technology or approach, I think, the idea of kind of containing everything. But you're still having the same problem, which is that in order for things to be functional, you need them to be, working and up to date. And so if you're not constantly refreshing all the parts of the packaging of your software object, you're going to run into the same problem. So thinking about preservation as active caretaking, I think, kind of tries to tease out some of the problems with containerization. But more to your point about, or my point, I guess, about, I'm not really, yeah, I guess so. I mean, I think it goes back to thinking about this the grapple software. I was really, in doing this case study analysis, we were able to talk to people and understand what they found significant and meaningful about that software. And so it wasn't really about it being functional necessarily. It was that, historians could look at it and understand different extinct computing languages just by looking at the documentation of the code printouts. Another one of our 5 case studies was MIT professor here who had software-driven art research project. Nick Monfort, for some of you who know him, right? So he does computational poetry. And it was, in talking with him and asking him what he might want to preserve about his own software, I mean, he was very clear that he did not want it needed to be functional, to be experienced in the way that, he had created it. And it may be because there's a component of artwork or artistic expression that he in particular feels, but understanding that as part of the kind of process, baking that in, as caretakers, we can be talking with our donors and people who are donating these materials to find out more about, what their ideal scenario is for caretaking. And so he was another, in a contrast example to sort of something that there wasn't really anything that he produced as part of that scholarship besides, it was really important to him to keep that experience part of the meaning. That was what was meaningful, is that someone needed to sit down and experience that software with the particular setup that he had with, he had the whole, told me all about his setup. So yeah, its significance is in the eye of the stakeholder, is what I'm hearing. Thank you. Sure.
Yeah, thanks. Nice to have you back. I think a lot about two things I don't think we have solved in any way whatsoever in any circles, but I'm curious if your work has touched on either of these things. One is there's I think about cloud storage, basically. Like we're outsourcing all of our research data and also lots of our software, most of our code, et cetera, to platforms like GitHub and Amazon Web Services and whatnot, all of which are private companies, you know, and we just don't know how long any of these things will last, right? Like this is the first go round of all this cloud storage, and so we don't know. So that seems like a big problem for the world to think about. The other thing is what you were just saying about interactivity. Like the line, I think, between web preservation and software preservation is pretty blurry, right? For many services that we use, but also, you know, games and anything that streams and, you know, Facebook. So I don't know where the like current thinking is, and I'm curious if your work has touched on either of those areas, or if you would like to.
Yeah, no, I actually, yes. Well, to address that, so were folks at the Clifford Lynch talk a couple of years ago, which seems just like yesterday to me, but where he talked about this very problem of how do we preserve dynamic and complex information in, you know, using web archives, assuming that our cultural heritage is literally, you know, at risk. And I would say that's definitely true. And I think the current thinking, I think people diverge because climate change is another sort of significant thing that's coming into the space in terms of like, potentially we shouldn't actually be, you know, preserving research software. We should be kind of adjusting our expectations about what it means to provide long-term access. So at least in the archives world, a lot of that is being talked about. And yeah, I mean, I think, you know, from our experiences, even doing that data rescue event, you know, it's like actually capturing this information is really, and putting it back together in a way that's meaningful is really tricky. And so Micah and I might in the future be working on a grant that will look specifically at how you can interact, like what's meaningful about web archives and how we interact with them. But I think it's sort of the fundamental problems that you pointed out is that, you know, it's a moving target, and I'm of two minds of that. You know, part of me is like, abandon everything, let's just make everything ephemeral and instant and et cetera. And, you know, the other part of me is like, oh, we need to archive everything. How do we get rid of the archival record? How do we understand history without the archival record? It's especially important in trying times, political times. So yeah, that's sort of a long-winded answer to, I think a lot of people, I think it's just a problem that everybody brings their own sort of personal views to, but it's an unsolved problem.
Thank you very much for attending. You can grab some more food on the way out. Thanks to Alex for her presentation. She'll make the slides available, and I'll log on them. And we will see you in the fall. Have a good summer, everyone.